swore an oath to God to protect his name, his followers, and his kingdom. The military orders of the Crusades answered the call when threat of annihilation was hanging in the balance. In an all-new series, James and Joanna Bogle discuss the heroic efforts of the defense of ancient Christendom.
Europe is attacked from the north, from the south, from the east, and from the northeast as well. We really, literally have attacks on all sides.
So arose the military orders and the Crusades, an all-new series here on the Global Catholic Network, EWTN.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the Military Orders and the Crusades. I'm Joanna Bogle, and with my husband Jamie, we're going to be looking at the Crusades and, more importantly, the Christian military orders that arose from them. Today we're going to be looking at defending the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Jamie, we've got to get the Crusaders to Jerusalem first, haven't we? So let's look at what history has come to call the First Crusade, although of course they didn't call it that. These are the labels that we give later on in order to make the thing comprehensible to us, otherwise it gets a bit complicated. So let's just recap. We're back in the 11th century. The Normans have just conquered Britain, Battle of Hastings 1066, and we have a situation where the church, which of course was established in the Middle East where Christ lived, is very much under pressure there because all of that part of the world has been taken over by Islam. And Europe, too, has been profoundly threatened by Islam, and Christian communities in Europe are now about to try to help those in the Middle East. That's roughly the scenario, right?
That's it. And if you remember, we've had the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, which effectively has rendered neutral the Empire of Byzantium. And following that, we then get a series of calls from the Byzantine Emperor to the Western Emperor and to the Pope for aid and assistance, which eventually is granted. Now, I have to remember, at that particular time, the Pope and the Emperor are locked in a battle called the investiture contest, so they don't really want to be diverting their attention away from that particular issue. Nevertheless, the invasion by Islam is so serious that they can't afford to ignore it.
Perhaps there was a thought on the part of the papacy that here was the Eastern Church, the Eastern Empire, asking for help, and that the Crusades, as we've come to call them, would be a coming together of East and West. I mean, there seems to have been some understanding of that, or not?
Partly that, yes, but the timeline is that the Great Schism is finally takes place in 1054, and then only 20 years later, the Byzantine army is eclipsed at Manzikert by the Muslim Turks. And they then find themselves in the position of having to sue for assistance from the West. Pope Urban, Blessed Urban II, realizes that this is a very important moment because it actually threatens not only the Byzantine Empire, but also the whole of the West. We've also, remember, got Spain has been taken, and there were incursions into France. And so he tries to persuade the Christian Western leaders to overcome their differences and to focus on the common enemy, and he succeeds in doing that at the Council of Clermont. All the people present there are taken up by the enthusiasm of his preaching, and almost as it were with the one voice they call out that it is the will of God in the language of the time. Well, actually it's a form of Latin that they were speaking. And that's what then leads to the First Crusade. And the First Crusade takes off with the aim of restoring the holy places, retaking Antioch and Jerusalem, which in due course the Crusaders succeed in doing. The Crusade is led by Godfrey of Bouillon, but there are also representatives from the other kingdoms. He is, in fact, Duke of Lower Lorraine, but other Christian kings and leaders also attend that crusade. But they are mainly, for example, Count Bohemond, Tancred de Hauteville. These are people who, they're not at the top of Christian society, they are part of the nobility. At this stage, the kings haven't yet committed themselves fully to the crusade. But apart from Godfrey de Bouillon, who's the Duke of Lower Lorraine. They succeed in getting as far as the Holy Land, which is no mean feat in those days, and they succeed in taking Antioch and eventually Jerusalem. There are a whole lot of mixed stories about what then happens. It seems that there was a lot of bloodshed, and that this is by no means something which redounds well to the Crusaders. But we have to remember that our records for that time are taken as much from other sources, for example, Islamic sources, and the interpretation that's been put on, not just the First Crusade, but all of the Crusades, is one that has been hostile to the Crusades, largely for reasons which are ideological as much as actually historical. And so we can't be 100% sure of the historical accuracy of some of the tales that are told. We do know, however, that Antioch and Jerusalem were taken. And
part of the tragedy was that not everybody even got to Jerusalem, because for reasons of poor leadership and so on, a whole lot of people who thought they were all part of the crusade never even got to Jerusalem, and in the Rhineland got deflected there and ended up in a disgraceful mob attacking the Jewish people.
Yes, but that is... these were unauthorized crusades. These were, if you like, mobs that were caught up in the enthusiasm and thought that they could go off and run a crusade on their own. For example, the one led by Peter the Hermit. These are really a distraction from the main issue. They have, of course, been hugely emphasized by people who are hostile to the whole idea of the Crusades, largely because they're hostile to the idea of Christianity. We have to remember that people come to these issues with a great deal of ideological baggage. They will, of course, say the same about the Christian and Catholic interpretation. But trying to sort out what the true picture is never an easy thing. One thing we can say is that, as we've pointed out in previous episodes of this series, is that Christendom was under a very serious threat from an aggressive Islamic plan of conquest, in effect.
That's clear. What is also interesting is that the Crusaders lacked perhaps what we're going to discover eventually emerge, which were the military orders and a greater sense of structure. So this mob that terrified the Jewish community and killed a number of them, the Jews, fled to the protection of the local archbishop, who afforded them a considerable measure of protection. So, as you say, this is really a deflection, but we need to see this in the context of the military orders. It was perhaps becoming clear that you do not want to just have a mob of people who think they're going to march right across the other side of the Mediterranean.
Yes, and in addition to that, of course, you had to, it's all very well, as we've seen from events even in our own time, it's all very well to invade a country, but you've got to police it, maintain the peace thereafter. So whilst the Crusaders managed to retake Jerusalem back, they, once they had done that particular task, wanted to go home. Who was to remain and keep order in Palestine after the Crusaders had left? And this is where the religious military orders came in. It shows the kind of commitment that was needed for an expeditionary force, not only to take and defend the Holy Land, which we must always remember had for hundreds and hundreds of years been part of the Eastern Roman Empire, which was now a spent force after the Battle of Manzikert. How were they going to do this except by maintaining a very disciplined force who would be able to defend what they had taken, maintain it, and maintain law and order. And it's significant that in order to do that, they had to have a force which was as dedicated, committed, religious and devout as the military orders, which subsequently came. We're going to hear a bit more about those. What we need now to do, though, is just to set the scene with the various crusades that took place.
So these religious and military orders, which we're now recognising and seeing particularly the need for them, would find their genesis in the aftermath of the initially successful, let us say, First Crusade. Just looking at that First Crusade, it's worth noting that the Pope, whom you've mentioned, Pope Urban, condemned the Rhineland massacres, and so when the people there, that was really the mob rule. So now we're in the Holy Land, and the Crusaders, who've decided that they were going to get to Jerusalem rather than slaughter people on the way, they have taken Jerusalem. But there's always this understanding that the Christians of Jerusalem, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, will be part of the wider Christendom. And it became known as Outremer, didn't it? This is overseas, Outremer. So it has to be...
That was a sort of colloquial way of referring to it.
Yeah,
it's really the Latin
French.
Kingdom of Jerusalem. The first leader was Godfrey de Bouillon himself, who didn't want to call himself King of Jerusalem because he felt that was a title that was inappropriate for a Christian to take.
Only Christ could be King of Jerusalem.
Effectively, that's what he meant, yes. So he called himself the Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, because remember the Holy Sepulchre is is the most sacred place, built over the place where it is said that the true cross was found by St. Helena back in the time of the Emperor Constantine. However, his successors in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem were not quite so scrupulous and called themselves Kings of Jerusalem. It's a title which inured right up until the 20th century, because the Emperors of Austria retained the title King of Jerusalem, König von Jerusalem. And this kingdom continued for about 100 years before the Muslims once again grew strong. What we see in this period is what historians have ended up calling the Crusades, and given various numbers to: First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, and so on. That isn't, of course, what they were called at the time. This is, once again, another imposition of later historians. What we really want to see and look at is the reality of what happened during those so-called Crusades. We see with the First Crusade, which was the most successful because it actually resulted in the retaking of Jerusalem. But the Muslims were not going to leave it at that, and eventually they retook the county of Edessa, because what we see with the Kingdom of Jerusalem is that satellite states were also set up, and to the north you had the county of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Edessa. These were, together with the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the four main Crusader kingdoms, or the Crusader states. Initially, the Muslims, after the fall of Jerusalem, did nothing about, or very little about, these Crusader states. But eventually, partly because they were themselves disunited, but eventually they reunited under the leadership of a man called Imad al-Din Zangi, and he began by a campaign to retake Edessa in 1144, which then led to the Second Crusade. And his son, who was has been called by his own people and historians Nur ad-Din, although his full name was Al-Malik al-Adil Nur ad-Din Abu al-Qasim Mahmud ibn Imad ad-Din Zangi, he lengthened his name, I think, to give himself a sense of grandeur. Subsequently became the thorn in the side of the Crusaders, and that led to the Second Crusade.
So we're now settled, as it were, in the Holy Land, Outremer, and there's a need to run and control and police this, and also to offer protection to Christians who want to visit the holy places and who have to bypass bandits and so on in order to get there. So with the difficulties that had arisen in getting there, the ghastly battle of Jerusalem, you now have this need, as it were, to, let's say, to police this territory, while the Islamic people are teaming up to make sure the Christians don't do anything of the kind.
Yes, but we begin to see also the re-strengthening of Muslims, because whilst they, like not only Muslims but Christians themselves, had fallen out amongst themselves, they began to see that their conquests were now under threat. The great flood tide that we talked about before of Islamic invasion was now under threat from a determined opposition among the Christian leaders, fired up by the preaching and of the popes and the papacy, and by privileges granted by the popes, with the aim of building up a religious feeling about the Crusades. This, of course, is distorted by historians who try to portray this as really either a land grab. Classically, of course, Marxist historians see everything in terms of seizure of economic power. This is rather an old-fashioned view now. But there was also, and still is, a view that there was largely fueled by a kind of religious fanaticism. Well, doubtless there was some of that. But why is it that only the Christians are criticised on this head and not Islam, or indeed any of the other religious groups who cause problems for Christian states? The reality is we're talking again about a stage in a defensive war which required an offensive. In other words, the retaking of lands and places, particularly Jerusalem, holy places, that have been taken by Islam.
But this religious fervour, I mean, clearly to go on a crusade was a very difficult thing. So the idea that you would undertake it in order to work out something for your own salvation was not something taken lightly. So it really must have meant that you had a deep sense that God was calling you to go on a crusade, and contemporary accounts rather reflect this. And again, we have a difference here between the crusader who undertakes this extremely difficult journey to this place a long way from home, from lack of water and everything when you get there, and the mob who just get deflected into bashing up some local people they don't like. The authentic crusader did have a religious motivation, and one which, if we fail to explore it, we miss entirely the point of what they would be doing and the sacrifices they were prepared to make. This was not an opportunity to go and be nasty to somebody. It involved going somewhere a very long way away, risking your land and home. And they actually had to pledge their land and everything in order to do it. I mean, going on a crusade costs money.
And the idea that it
wasn't something you're going to acquire.
Yeah, and the idea that it was just the younger sons on a land grab is a gross oversimplification, as Father Schofield points out in his article. Many of the kings themselves and elder sons who already had inherited went on crusade and made a lot of sacrifices in order to do so. To be fair also, the Muslim side were inspired by religious zeal for their own religion. Some were themselves inspired by less noble motives, and others were more attractive, more noble figures. And I'm thinking particularly of the figure known to us as Saladin, Yusuf Salah ad-Din ibn Ayyub, who was the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty. He himself was a Muslim nobleman. He restored Sunni Islam to Egypt, and he was one of the most successful leaders of Islam, probably the most successful against the Crusaders and retaking what had initially been conquered by Islam. Salah ad-Din is an impressive figure in many ways, unlike many other of the Muslim leaders, including some who came later, like, for example, Baybars, who was a Turk, who was initially a Kipchak Turk who's taken as a slave, became one of the Mamluks. The Mamluks were slaves who were turned into soldiers for the Islamic cause. This is one of the things that Islamic leaders did. They would capture a nation and take the captured people, turn them into slaves. Initially Mamluks, then later on we see the Janissaries, which are Christian slaves turned into Muslim warriors. And Baybars was one of these, and he established the Mamluk dynasty in Egypt and the Middle East. Full name, another exotic name, Al-Malik al-Zahir Rukn al-Did Baybars al-Bundukardi. He was a much less attractive figure. He would make promises to the Crusader castles whom he invested and to the towns he invested of clemency, of freeing or respecting the freedom of the civilians, and then immediately taking the city he would have everybody slaughtered. Now, this is something that you don't often hear about because people are too busy criticizing the Christians and the Crusaders, but that is the reality of it. But returning to Salah ad-Din, he was a successful general as well as being a religious leader. And it was he who inflicted one of the greatest defeats on the Crusaders at the Horns of Hattin. And this was because of various fallings out in the Crusader camp. A mistake was made in taking the Crusader army to a position which was very exposed, very hot, where they had no wells to, or such wells as there were, had been poisoned. And they suffered a huge defeat at the hands of Saladin. And when they were, the Templars and the Hospitallers were captured, unusually, because Saladin knew that they were his most formidable enemies, because of their commitment and devotion and discipline, he had them all executed. But he didn't have everybody executed. He was, in that respect, rather more humane among Islamic leaders. And that we begin to see after the Horns of Hattin, and Saladin thereafter retook Jerusalem, the beginnings of a decline in the fortunes of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem.
So that initial First Crusade had captured Jerusalem and something had been established, but then, because of presumably also the difficulty of keeping an army, keeping the Crusaders supplied, I mean the supply lines, to use modern terms, would be extremely long, going all the way back essentially to Europe, and having to cope with the sea routes of the Mediterranean, land routes across Europe. So equipment, supplies, information would be difficult to sustain. So we begin what, in effect, viewed from history, is something like a long retreat, and a very tragic one, because we're speaking here of very difficult terrain and so on. And so
yes,
the Crusades have got a sorrow about them.
They have, but we must also remember that a considerable civilization was set up in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem for that 100 years that Outremer continued. We have these magnificent Crusader castles, which were then copied back in mainland Europe. That's where you get the concept of medieval castles. It begins
there
in
across France and Britain and so on.
And you see castles like Crusader castles like Crac des Chevaliers, Carrac de Moab, Southend, Castle Pilgrim, all still there because they were so well built. But they weren't sufficient in the end to withstand a huge Muslim besieging, and particularly with a general like Saladin. And when he captures Jerusalem and Acre in 1187, this gives rise to the Third Crusade, which is called often the King's Crusade. We begin to see the kings of Europe starting to take an interest, and we see Philip II of France, we see Richard the Lionheart, we see Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor, who unfortunately was drowned on his way to the Holy Land in Cilicia, which was the Armenian Christian kingdom. Richard recaptures Acre. They defeat the Muslims in Azov, near the port city of Jaffa, but they do not succeed in recapturing Jerusalem. And the best that Richard Lionheart can do is to negotiate a treaty with Saladin to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims to go to Jerusalem. But Jerusalem remains under Muslim control.
And so we're now getting into what we're calling the Third and Fourth Crusades.
Yes. Well, briefly put, the Fourth Crusade was again the intention of retaking the holy places back and Jerusalem back, but it was diverted to the sack of Constantinople, and this was it's a complicated issue, but in simple terms, the Byzantine Empire was hostile to the West, hostile to the papacy. It had entered into trade negotiations with the Venetians. It owed the Venetians a lot of money. The Venetians were necessary to the Crusade. The Crusaders were persuaded to get back the Venetians' money. And when the Byzantines refused, they invaded. There was a sack of Constantinople, and a Latin kingdom, or Empire of Constantinople, was set up. Pope was very unhappy, Pope Innocent III, because there had been a diversion. But it wasn't as simple, perhaps, as it has been portrayed, because this extended supply route meant that the Crusaders were dependent upon what assistance they could get en route. After that, we get the Fifth Crusade, we get the Albigensian Crusade, we get the Sixth, Seventh and Eighth Crusades, and it's the Seventh and Eighth Crusades when you see St. Louis of France. And we see this chap Baibars, who sweeps all before him and retakes, after the death of Saladin and his successor Al-Kamil, we see the Holy Land once again being swept away from the Christians. There had been an opportunity earlier on to retake Jerusalem, but that had failed, and subsequently thereafter we see Baibars carrying all before him. And eventually the Mamluk leader, Baibars, is able to defeat Crusaders with his brutal tactics that eventually, after the Ninth Crusade, we see the Franks and the Christians being ousted altogether from Palestine with the fall of Acre in 1291.
So it's a noble in many ways, but in other ways very tragic and sometimes rather brutal story. The tragedy of the sacking of Constantinople and so on, these are things that linger today, and the tragedy of the Crusades, but for all that also their courage and their bravery and something that was achieved and something which lingers today and something about Christian heritage. We're going to find out more about why they needed really organised soldiery. Stay with us, therefore, as we continue to explore the Crusades and the military orders. Next time, we'll be looking at the Knights Templar, one of the great religious military orders that emerged from this era of the Crusades. Come with us then as we continue to explore the military orders and the Crusades.